light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. When I went to graduate school, I was initially very confused by the fact that all the discussions oriented around categorization. And when I attempted to speak of individuality, it seemed that the only individuality people understood was what I would call narcissistic individuality, that which was focused inward and essentially in my extensive contemplation on what narcissism really is, what makes it narcissism, one of the phrases I came up with is that narcissism is the negation of relationship. That when you have true narcissism, there is no relationship. There is nothing but the self. And in the original Greek mythology of Narcissus, there's a couple different versions of the story, but basically that he saw his reflection in a pool of some sort and became so entranced by it that he literally stared at it until he died, until there was nothing left. It's as if everything in the world around him, every person, every circumstance, every need of his own body suddenly disappeared, and there was nothing except his reflection. I've occasionally heard people say that so-and-so is just too full of himself. And I would often respond that, well, actually he's not, because if he was full of himself, he would be aware of his own multidimensional nature and his infinite potential and all the other positive things as well. It seems to me that whenever someone says so-and-so is full of himself or full of herself or whatever, that what they're actually referring to is an empty void where a healthy sense of self should be. There's a sense in which people try to overcompensate for what they don't feel. The more one doesn't feel confident, the more one tries to pretend that one does. And it becomes this external performance that is supposed to hide the fact that inwardly there is absolute insecurity. That the more someone thinks they're ugly, the more they do to themselves to make themselves beautiful. The more one thinks that one is clumsy, the harder they work to excel in ballet or gymnastics or whatever. Which is not to say that everyone who excels in these areas is overcompensating, but I think we've all met people on occasion that we could tell were overcompensating. It was like they were trying too hard, and sometimes I've kind of looked at the person and said, are you trying to convince me or yourself? I'm so good at this, I'm so good at this. Are you trying to convince me or yourself? Because if you really were good at it, you could just do it and you wouldn't have to convince anyone because it would be obvious in what you do. But in many cases, I don't know that I needed them to be an expert at whatever it was anyway. I was just thankful they were there and trusted them to do their best. But if it wasn't absolutely perfect, it wasn't the end of the world. We could deal with having things that were not quite perfect as long as we did our best. In terms of, so when I got to graduate school and I kept trying to express to them what individuality is, because it didn't seem like anybody really knew. And I still, and maybe it's one of the perpetual questions of humanity, that when people talk about getting to a point in life where someone needed to go find himself, and on a comedic note, someone might say, well, was he lost? Maybe he never found himself in the first place. All sorts of different ways we could do word plays on that, but the basic point being, when someone asks, who are you? Well, I'm a plumber. No, that's what you do. Who are you? Who are you? What makes your perspective, consciousness, whatever, totally unique in the whole spectrum of humanity? Considering how many billions upon billions of people there have been, and to contemplate that no two of them have ever been exactly the same. there is something that makes each person unique, and if it is nurtured and valued and treasured, could be a benefit to the whole of humanity. Often our world is so busy dealing with crowd control, as someone put it, that we don't take the time to nurture the individuals, and consequently humanity remains impoverished because the wonderful things that could have been contributed by that individual were never done. They weren't nurtured, they weren't brought out, they weren't shared. They're not part of human history because they were left untended. It's where I've heard more than a few ministers actually comment that in talking about sins, misdeeds or wrongdoings, but more especially talking about things that are counted as sins. Well, perhaps this is actually revealing my Roman Catholic heritage more, because the two categories that are sometimes referenced are sins of omission or sins of commission. Sins of commission or sins of commission or commission are things that you do. Sins of omission are things that you didn't do, that you neglected, that you failed to do, things that needed to be done but weren't. I've heard numerous ministers comment over the years that people are always more distraught by their sins of omission more than by their sins of commission. It's the things that we didn't do that we could have done that haunt us more than I made a mistake and I did too much. It's the sins of not loving someone when they needed it, not taking advantage of an opportunity when the opportunity was there. In a similar sort of way, I guess, in trying to define the term of individuality to my fellow students and colleagues when I was in graduate school, kind of coming back to that center point of saying, here I am, and here's everything around me. And even while I was there, I kept getting this encouragement to think that I'm not supposed to know who I am until society tells me to which category I belong, because my identity is supposed to come from the categories. But being autistic, I knew from day one that I had my own unique way of looking at things and experiencing things. I saw all the details, and in my understanding, adding all these details together, recognizing that I was the only one that had my memories and my particular collection of experiences, it became obvious to me almost immediately that what made me an individual was being a unique collection of experiences and perceptions and memories and so forth. Where community happens is by having more and more individuals coming together and acting in concert, acting collaboratively, acting as a group. But even within every group I've ever encountered or experienced, there are individuals who sometimes go along with things because it needs to be a group activity, but some feel more strongly about it, some feel less strongly about it. But the thing I noticed in that is that healthy, true individuality, inevitably, inescapably, exists within a constellation of relationships. In order for me to exist at all, there had to be some basic family to provide food, clothing, and shelter when I was still an infant. In order for a fur trapper in the Old West to exist at all, having left all the European cities behind and everything, he would still be dependent upon a community of plants and animals to provide sufficient food and shelter, and the community of the land itself, communities of rocks and streams and mountains and caves and so forth. All these things, all the different forms of life, some animate, some inanimate, but all the different forms of life had to form a community in order for the individual to survive. If you have an individual living in an absolute vacuum with no community of other elements or beings or anything around, the person would immediately suffocate and die. It is impossible to be an individual without a constellation of relationships. We are inevitably related to our environment. The question is whether we are relating to our environment in a constructive, positive way, or whether we are relating to our environment in a negative way. The point that I'm trying to orient this discussion around, though, is distinguishing between the relational individuality that I understood early in life and the narcissistic individuality that was presented to me in graduate school. That one expects the world to orient around the self. One of the peculiar ways that I phrased it in the first 3 months at graduate school at a graduate level theological institution, one of the most astonishing things I had to note in my first few months there was when I recognized that really, judging by the behavior, the majority of people there didn't believe in God. And I mentioned that to someone the other day, and they were very astonished, and they said, "Not believe in God at a theological school?" And I said, well, let me clarify. Because in my understanding, that which is truly God is a convergence of an embodiment, if you will, of love and wisdom that is so completely beyond human comprehension. The embodiment of highest wisdom and greatest love. And whether that assumes a particularly humanoid form or not is entirely up to God to decide. God can appear or not in whatever way God chooses. It's not for humanity to command God to look this way, behave that way, or anything else. In theological school, I discovered in the first 3 months or so that the majority of people with whom I was interacting did not believe that God existed beyond the reaches of their own chosen human theology. To which I responded, if God is no bigger than human theology, God isn't big enough to be God. I guess that's where I come back to referring to the divine as divine mystery. And I sometimes describe myself as an eclectic mystic, because as I was reading about the various mystics throughout time, all over the world, in different religions even. I mean, there were Christian mystics and Islamic mystics and Jewish mystics and pagan mystics, and they seem to have more in common with each other than they had with their own religions. In every case, what I noticed is basically three things. That they focused more on the essence of God than the form. You know, that God could take any form God wanted. Plant, animal, mineral, person, whatever. You know, God could look like an angel, or a pillar of fire, or a pillar of smoke, or a burning bush, or a rock, or a white buffalo, or whatever. God could take whatever form God wanted to take. It was completely within the prerogative of the divine to assume whatever form. Which I guess makes sense if you think of God as energy also, that an energy so advanced and intelligent and loving and wise that it can produce any mass it needs at whatever point in time and revert back to energy whenever it chooses also. But somehow always remaining mysterious to a human form that knows only a few of the many possible dimensions of being. In conceiving, well, the 3 points of the mystics, relating to the essence more than the form, and kind of parallel to that, relating to the questions more than the answers, which is where mystics, in my reading, didn't seem to get into dogmatic arguments about what was true or not. It was about questions. You know, what does the love of God mean? How do I ever put that in practice? How much of being the embodiment of love can a human being understand? And mystics would spend their whole lives meditating on these questions and drawing more and deeper, ever deeper understanding out of them, rather than getting tied up in dogmatic arguments about what the answers were. because answers are always limiting. The questions were always open-ended and allowed for exploration and growth and all kinds of vastness, not smallness. Answers and dogma are always small and limited. But the fascinating thing was having envisioned God as an essence primarily approached through questions, the mystics still had this intense day-to-day, moment-to-moment relationship with the divine, where their faith in divine mystery affected every choice they made, every moment of life. It was very intense and real and immediate. There was no separation between them and the practice of their faith, the living out of their faith, and however they defined it or expressed it. And for me, that comes very much into the discussion of individuality, that there's a sense in which every individual is a spark of the divine. Every individual consciousness, a little piece, a little spark, a tiny little piece of divine energy, looking for, in some respects, a way to rejoin a sense of wholeness, but also on the way there, looking for whatever will develop and educate and whatever will allow that spark to learn more of what it means to be this incredible wholeness. And by having this individual experience, also having more memories to bring to the greater conversation, if you will. That sounds like such a ridiculous academic term in a way, but that's kind of what it is. It's an ongoing conversation without there ever being a final word. In being a relational individual, one has qualities, one has a unique perspective, one has a unique use of language. You may choose to act in contrast to your subcultural environment. Some people grow up in an environment and see the evils and the foibles of it and react against it and do everything in their power to be completely the opposite and to some degree succeed. Others grow up in an environment and, whether through not doing self-reflection or whatever, wind up growing up and taking on everything they're told, but never really developing a sense of who they are, as if everything that has to do with their individual reality is simply overlooked because it's devalued, and what is valued are only the realities assigned to the group as a whole, not the realities that can be discovered within an individual. Because narcissism, in my understanding, is the negation of relationship, that's where, and consequently, the negation of life, because you cannot sustain life without relationship. That to me says that's the way that we don't want to go. That what we want is the relational individuality, because unless one comes to know oneself as an individual, you don't have as much to give to the group. You don't know how to pick roles according to what you do best, and may wind up in a situation where you spend your whole life doing what you really don't do very well at all, because someone told you that was your job. Everyone, in high school, to a very limited framework, when everyone was supposed to learn how to play football. Well, I had no use for football. I don't know the first thing about it or what to do with it. And it has not served me in any way, but that was something that I was required to do in high school. But it was actually learning football, you could say, was acting against my own integrity. It had nothing to do with who I am as an individual or with where my life was going. It was a societally imposed experience of dishonesty. It was totally dishonest for me to be there learning football because it wasn't right for me. It attempted to teach me a competition that I refused because I could see all the ways that was used to abuse people and to devalue people who needed to be loved, not devalued. In being a relational individual within that situation, then, rather than a narcissistic individual, just as much as I was aware of my own experience and of how I saw things, I needed to put myself out there, as they say. I needed to invite conversation. I needed to invite interaction with other people who were clearly unique and anomalous individuals who maybe had never thought about how they were unique or what to do about it. But in learning how the world looks through their eyes, it gave me the ability to see a much more holistic and complete understanding and perception of the world through my own eyes. It's kind of like I never really understood what an indirect object was until I studied it in German. And by studying how this piece of grammar functions in a foreign language, that's when I finally began to understand what it means and how it works within English. Because in English, it is so camouflaged into everything else. I had a hard time defining what it was and what it wasn't, and where it was and how it functioned and so forth. In studying a foreign language, I suddenly had a different way of looking at things that made my own perceptions so much clearer. In attempting to describe to people this notion of being an individual, it very much starts with self-reflection. I know there are a lot of people going through life who don't take any time for self-reflection. And if you ask them, what do you enjoy? They may or may not have an answer for you. What would you find true in this situation? How would you respond to that situation? What inspires you? What is your aspiration? I met a lot of people who swear they don't have any aspirations, and as I watch their actions, I really doubt that that's true. But their answer and my observation kind of confirm that the basic problem is that they're not aware of their aspiration. There's some purpose, some deeper purpose, some love, some affinity, some aptitude within them that wants a certain action or involvement to give purpose and meaning to their lives. If they don't do the self-reflection necessary, whether through journaling or meditating or talking with others or however they decide to do it, to spend the time necessary to come to a point of knowing who they are as a person, even just a tentative point, because it never really ends. The full name of Sister Who is Sister Who Does She Think She Is? And it's a question of identity, but it's a question that the answer to which changes throughout life. Who I think I am today is not who I thought I was 10 years ago. And as that evolves and shifts and grows, my expressions similarly evolve and change and grow, to where the way I express myself now is not how I expressed myself 10 and 20 years ago, because I believe myself to be someone now that I didn't know or didn't believe about myself then. Being an individual, though, is equally about tending to those relationships. And individuality within a context of relationships is relational individuality, but that means not only that you are aware of what makes your perspective unique, but that you are seeking to support everyone else finding for themselves what makes their perspective unique. And as each of you becomes familiar with each other's perspective and experience and so forth, that it becomes also clear how you can support each other in the ongoing development of that. The ongoing development of, when I was such and such age, I dreamed that I would be that. And now that I'm this age, it has evolved into that. And maybe someday I'll get there, or maybe it'll evolve again and I'll be somewhere else. And it's okay. It is so much more important in the midst of all that to remember the pursuits of love and wisdom, because those are the core, at the heart of every religious system, every philosophical group, every familial group. It's all about pursuits of love and wisdom. And understanding that those pursuits happen on an individual and local and communal level just as much as on a higher species-wide level. That there is something about being diverse and unique and together that makes life worth living, and that allows us to build brighter tomorrows, opportunities and places and ways to be that ultimately weren't available to previous generations. Because we're not here forever and they weren't available to previous generations, that says all the more to me that we need to take advantage of what's in front of us. To take advantage of it, not in a using sort of way, but take advantage of it as an opportunity to launch ourselves further and higher and wider and broader and wiser than we ever thought possible. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that my comments in the last half hour have been helpful to you. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved ever be.